At 75, Winona Carlisle believed that a mother's 40 years of sacrifice had earned her a permanent place at her own son's table. She had set that table herself most of those years. The soot brick duplex on South Branson Street had a kitchen that faced east, and every morning the light came in over the rooftops where the malleable ironworks used to throw sparks against the dark. The furnaces had been cold for 30 years. Her chair had not moved in 50. It sat at the head of the kitchen table by the window, and from it she had watched a husband buried, a son raised, and a neighborhood empty out one shuttered storefront at a time. She thought a chair earned that way could not be taken. But before the leaves turned on Branson Street, the iron door her grandfather welded shut in 1948 would decide which Carlisle owned a single brick of Marion, and it would not be the one who handed her the eviction notice. It happened at her own birthday supper. Garrett had insisted on hosting it, which should have been her first warning. Garrett never hosted anything. He arrived in a car that cost more than the house, with his wife Denise and a sheet cake from the Good Bakery on Washington Street, and he kissed his mother's cheek and called her the queen of the evening. There were 11 people in that kitchen. Winona counted them later, the way a stenographer counts everything because the room would matter. She was still holding her fork when he stood up and tapped his glass. "I want to say something about Mom," Garrett said, and the table went warm and quiet the way tables do. 40 years she gave to this house, raised me here. And the thing about love, real love, is knowing when to make the smart call for the people you love. Winona smiled. She did not yet understand. "The duplex is going to be put to better use," her son said. He slid a folded letter across the tablecloth, past the salt, past the gravy boat, and laid it down beside her cake. "It's all handled, Mom. You don't have to worry about a thing." She looked at the envelope. Her name was typed on it, not written, typed. "Garrett," she said, "what is this?" "It's a transition plan." He used the voice he used for clients. "There's a real nice facility out by the bypass. Hot meals, people your own age. You've been rattling around in this place by yourself too long. It isn't safe and it isn't smart." Across the table, Denise was not looking at Winona at all. Denise was holding her phone up at an angle, and the small click it made was the click of a camera. She was photographing the kitchen, the cabinets, the window with the morning light. She was already photographing the rooms for the listing, while the woman who lived in them sat there with cake on her plate. "You're selling my house," Winona said. "It was always going to come to me," Garrett said, and there was an edge in it now, fast, like he had rehearsed the soft part, but not this. "Be reasonable. You'd only let it rot." "I'm managing your affairs, Mom. Somebody has to." There is a particular silence that falls when a room full of people decides all at once to study their plates. Winona heard it. 11 people and not one fork moved. "Read the letter, Winona," Denise said, gentle, not looking up from her phone. 30 days is very generous. 30 days. She had carried this man for 9 months and raised him for 18 years and kept his secrets for 40, and he had given her 30 days and a sheet cake. She did not cry. The relatives who put her own mother out all those years ago, the ones who stood on a porch and said that a widow with nothing was no use to anyone now, had taught Winona at the age of 9 exactly what a face must not do when the floor opens under it. She had sworn at 9 that she would never be a thing people decided what to do with. She would never be furniture. And here her son had found the one word in the English language she could not survive hearing, and he had not even had the courage to say it out loud. He had typed it on an envelope. He had her moved, like a chair. "Disposable," she said very quietly, to no one. "What was that, Mom?" "Nothing." Winona folded her napkin and set it beside her plate, squared to the edge, the way she squared everything. "Thank you all for coming."
Thank you.
She did not touch the cake. "Now, you know the kind of son, the one who can find the money for a facility brochure and a sheet cake and a car with heated seats, but never once found a Tuesday afternoon to fix his mother's storm door. Garrett Carlisle had spent his whole life being owed things. He believed the house was owed to him the way he believed the morning was owed to him. What the 11 people in that kitchen did not know, what Garrett especially did not know, was that the duplex on South Branson Street had a cellar, and the cellar had a door, and the door had been sealed shut by a man who could read a balance sheet better than any banker his grandson would ever hire. But that comes later. First, the 30 days. They left around 9. Denise hugged her and said something about how it was all for the best, and Garrett squeezed her shoulder and told her he'd send someone Monday to talk about packing. Like packing was a thing other people did to your life while you watched. Then the cars pulled away from the curb and the house was quiet, and Winona Carlisle stood alone in the kitchen with a cake she did not want and a letter she had not opened. She opened it then. She read it the way she had read 10,000 depositions, slowly, every word. No skipping. Notice to vacate. The signature at the bottom was Garrett's, but the language above it was a lawyer's, and there was a second name on the cover sheet, a title company, and a number that she understood without being told was the number her son would walk away with once the soot brick duplex was scraped clean of her. What the letter did not explain was why a man with a car like that needed the money so badly his hand had pressed hard enough to dent the paper when he signed. She would learn that part soon. For now, she only knew the shape of it, the way you know a storm is coming by the smell before you see a cloud. Garrett was not putting her out because she was a burden. Garrett was drowning, and he had decided his mother was the nearest thing he could throw overboard. Winona set the letter face down on the table. Then she did a thing she had done 1,000 times when the world tilted, a thing 40 years at a courthouse machine had wired into her hands. She lifted her right hand into the empty kitchen air and she wrote, not words, pothooks, the little hooks and curves and slants of Greg's shorthand, the dead language her grandfather Amos had pressed into her at the age of 6, sitting her on his knee at this very table and saying, slow now, again. Her family called it scribble. Garrett, as a teenager, had called it the thing nobody on earth reads anymore. Denise had once asked her, with a smile like a closed door, whether it bothered her that she'd given 40 years to a skill that machines did now in half a second. It did not bother her. Her hand moved in the lamplight, writing notice and vacate and disposable into the air where no one could read them but her, and the motion steadied her the way prayer steadies other people. When her hand stopped, she was looking at the cellar door. It was set into the wall at the back of the kitchen, past the pantry, half hidden behind the old chest freezer that had not run since Eisenhower. Not the wooden door to the everyday cellar where she kept the canned tomatoes, the other one. Beyond the canning shelves, at the bottom of the cold stone steps, there was a second door, and it was made of iron. Hand-forged iron, black with age, with hinges as thick as her wrist. There was no handle. There was a keyhole, and the keyhole had been filled. Packed solid with wax and pressed into the wax, a small round seal, a foundry man's mark, the kind they stamped on iron to say this was finished, this was true, this would not be opened again. Her grandfather had welded that door shut in the winter of 1948, the year the iron works was sold out from under the men who ran it. Winona had been an infant. She had walked past that door her entire life. So had her father. So had Garrett 100 times, on his way to nowhere, never once curious. Because curiosity was work, and Garrett did not do work that didn't pay by Friday. Nobody in the family knew what was behind it. There was a story that Amos had bricked up a coal chute. There was a story that he'd sealed a flooded well. There was the thing Amos himself had said near the end, when his mind was supposed to be going soft, the thing they had all nodded at and quietly filed under the old man's wandering. He had gripped Winona's wrist, in his bed, with more strength than a dying man should have, and he had looked at her, only her, and said it plain. The cold room keeps its word. They had patted his hand and told the doctor he was confused. Winona, 12 years old, had written it down in shorthand in the little pad she carried even then, because she wrote down everything her grandfather said. She had not understood it. She had been carrying it for 63 years. She stood now at the top of the cellar stairs in a quiet house that her son had already sold out from under her, and for the first time in her life, that sentence did not sound like the ramble of a man at the end of his road. It sounded like an instruction. Winona went to the hall closet and took down her good wool coat, the gray one, because the cellar was cold even in summer. She put it on, and as her fingers found the inside pocket out of 50 years of habit, they touched the thing that always lived there, the thing she had carried so long she had stopped feeling it. A small rectangle of celluloid, yellowed, worn soft at the corners, a shorthand alphabet card, the little chart of the strokes, the legend of the whole secret language, every pothook and its sound printed in a fine old hand. Amos had slipped it into her coat pocket the day he taught her the first letter, when she was 6, and told her never to lose it, and she never had. She had thought of it for 69 years as a keepsake, a grandfather's trinket, a scrap of a dead man's love. She closed her hand around it now and did not yet know that she was holding a key. What she knew was simpler. She knew that her grandfather, Amos Carlisle, had been a careful man, a man who measured twice and signed nothing he had not read 3 times, and that careful men do not weld a door shut over a flooded well. They weld a door shut over something they mean to keep, and they tell only the one grandchild who learned the language. The cold room keeps its word, and they trust that someday, when that grandchild has nothing left, she will finally understand that the words were a deed. Winona Carlisle opened the wooden cellar door. The stairs went down into the dark, into the smell of cold stone and old iron and time. She found the string for the bare bulb and pulled it, and the light swung, and at the bottom of the steps the black iron door waited where it had waited for 78 years. She came down the last step and stood in front of it. She laid her palm flat against the cold metal, and in the swinging light she saw for the first time what was scratched into the wooden beam just above the frame, low and careful, in a hand she would have known anywhere. 2 words and a name she had never heard in her life. El Tournier, El Tournier. She stood with her palm on the iron and read those 2 words again, and they meant nothing to her. There had never been a Tournier in the family, not at any funeral she had stenographed in her head, not in the family Bible with its water-stained pages, not in any story Amos had told her on his knee at the kitchen table. And yet here the name was, scratched into the beam by the same careful hand that had scratched her own initials into the underside of that table when she was small, so she would always know which one was hers. A stranger's name, kept where only a person who came all the way down to the iron door would ever find it. She did not try to force the door that night. Forcing was not in her. A stenographer learns young that the record is made by going slow and missing nothing, and she had decided somewhere on those cold steps that whatever Amos had sealed away she would open the way he would have wanted it opened, carefully, lawfully, with the right man for the work. The right man lived 2 streets over on Nebraska Street, in a narrow house with a brass sign by the door, so old the letters had gone green. Hollis Dupree had been the locksmith in that part of Marion for 50 years before his knees retired him, and he was the only person Winona could think of who would understand that a sealed door was a kind of promise and not just a problem. She walked over the next morning with the gray coat buttoned to her throat, the celluloid card riding in the inside pocket where it had ridden for 69 years. Hollis came to the door in his suspenders with coffee going cold in his hand and listened to her without once interrupting, which was its own rare courtesy. When she finished, he set the cup down on the porch rail. Welded and waxed, he said, and a foundry seal pressed in the wax. Yes. Then somebody didn't want it opened by accident. He looked at her a long moment, and there was something in his face that was not curiosity. It was respect, the kind one old craftsman gives another. You know what's behind it? No, Winona said, but I know who put it there, and I know he left it for me. Hollis Dupree got his bag. It took him most of the afternoon. He would not use a torch, said a torch was for men in a hurry, and a hurry was how you ruined a thing worth saving. He worked the wax out of the keyhole grain by grain with a dental pick, set the little foundry seal aside on a clean cloth like it was a communion wafer, and then he went at the welds with a patience that made Winona's chest ache, because it was the patience nobody in her own family had ever once shown her. The bare bulb swung. The cold came up off the stone, and at last, near 5 o'clock, with a sound like a long breath let out after 78 years, the iron door swung inward on its wrist-thick hinges. Hollis stepped back. He did not look inside. He picked up his bag and he picked up his cloth with the seal folded in it, and he put it in her hand, and he said the thing she would remember for the rest of her life. "I can open the door, Winona. Only you can read what's behind it." Then he climbed the stairs and left her alone with the cold room. It was small, smaller than she'd imagined a lifetime of wondering. Stone on every side, dry as a bone, the air inside it still and old and faintly sweet, like the inside of a closed piano. There were shelves, and on the shelves, in the swinging light, there were tins. Not treasure the way a child imagines treasure, no gold spilling from a chest. Japanned biscuit tins, the black and red kind that had held shortbread before the First War, stacked and labeled in a hand she knew, bundles of paper tied with butcher's string, long flat folders gone the color of weak tea, and in the center of the middle shelf, set apart, a single tin with her grandfather's initials scratched into the lid. A.C. Amos Carlisle. She took it down with both hands. It was heavier than biscuits. She carried it up the stairs, into the kitchen light, set it on the table at her own place, and lifted the lid. Steno pads. A dozen of them, maybe more. The spiral kind worn soft at the corners, every page filled top to bottom with the small, slanting strokes of Greg's shorthand. Pothooks. The scribble nobody on earth read anymore. Garrett had called it that to her face when he was 16, and she had been writing a grocery list in it out of habit. The thing nobody reads. And here was her grandfather, dead these many years, speaking to her across all of it in the one language he had made sure she would keep. Winona sat down in her chair. She put on her reading glasses, and she began very slowly to read. The first page was a date, the winter of 1948. The next was a list, and as her eye learned the old man's hand again, his particular loops and the way he shortened the words he used most, the list began to resolve into something that made her set the pad down and press her hand flat against her mouth. It was a register of bonds. Series E and Series F war bonds by the dozen, each one with its serial number copied out in careful pothooks, each one with a maturity she did her arithmetic on twice because the first time she did not believe it. Beside the bonds, deeds, lot numbers, a description of the duplex itself, and beside it a phrase Amos had underlined twice in his shorthand so it stood out from the rest, the way a man underlines the thing he most needs the future to understand. Held in trust. Carlisle Family Trust. Established 1948. Not to be sold by any single hand. Winona sat back. The kitchen ticked around her. Out the east window the light was going down over the rooftops where the iron works used to throw its sparks, and she understood all at once and all the way down what her grandfather had done. He had not hidden money in a wall like a frightened man. He had taken the buyout the men got when the foundry was sold out from under them in 1948, the money that should have scattered and been spent and vanished the way such money always did, and he had turned it into bonds and deeds and locked it inside, a trust that no one person could break. Then he had sealed it in the cold room, and he had written the only map to it in a language he taught to exactly one person in the whole line of his blood. Her. The granddaughter who learned the strokes at 6 and never once complained that her hand cramped. He had looked 78 years down the road, past his own son and past his great-grandson, and he had planned the rescue of a woman who had not yet been born to need it. The cold room keeps its word. It was not the rambling of a man whose mind was going. It was the plainest sentence he ever spoke. The cold room, the cellar, it kept its word, and the word was this tin, and the word was for her. She read until past midnight. She read until the strokes swam and her eyes burned, and then she slept 4 hours and got up and read more, because there was no one to make breakfast for and no one to tell her to stop, and because for the first time since Garrett tapped his glass, she did not feel like furniture. She felt like a clerk of the court with the record open in front of her and a duty to get every word of it right. It was on the third night that the strokes began to surprise her. She'd been working through the pads in order, the way Amos had numbered them in the corner, and she had grown used to the rhythm of it, bond and serial and deed and trust. But when she turned to page 19 of the second pad, the hand changed. Not the writing, the matter. Here was a bond like the others, a good one, a large one, the serial copied out clean. But where every other entry carried a Carlisle name beside it, this one did not. It was made out to a child who was not a Carlisle, a name she had never heard inside these walls, written in her grandfather's careful pothooks, and beside it, in the margin, a note he had pressed hard enough that the pencil had nearly gone through the paper. She is owed too. Winona lowered the pad to the table. She is owed too. 3 words, and they turned the whole thing sideways. Because a man hiding money for his own blood she could understand. That was love, narrow and ordinary, the love that builds a wall around its own. But a man who took some of that same hidden fortune and set it aside in secret for a child outside the blood, a child whose name meant nothing to the family that would inherit the rest, that was not ordinary love. That was a debt. That was a promise made in private and kept in code, where the people who might object would never think to look because they could not read. She turned the page, looking for the child's name again, and there it was, repeated. And this time it was followed by the name of the parent, and Winona felt the cold of the cellar come up through the floor and into her chair. The parent's name was Tournier, L. Tournier. The 2 words scratched into the beam above the iron door. Not a stranger, after all, or not the kind of stranger she had thought. A name Amos had carved where she would find it on her way in, the way you write a thing on your hand so you will not forget it, and then written again, here, in the ledger, beside a bond made out to a Tournier child with the words, "She is owed," 2 pressed hard into the margin. Who was L. Tournier that her grandfather had carried this debt for 78 years in a sealed room, in a dead language, where no one but the one grandchild who loved him enough to learn it would ever come to settle it? Winona Carlisle took off her glasses and set them on the open pad and looked out the dark window toward the place where the furnaces used to burn. She had 30 days, -3 now, before her son's men came to put her out like a chair. She had a trust she did not yet fully understand, and a fortune written in pothooks, and a promise to a stranger's child that her grandfather had laid, gently and deliberately, into her hands. She was 75 years old, and for the first time in a long time, she had work to do that only she could do. She picked the glasses back up and she turned the page. The next morning the knock came soft, 2 raps and a pause and a third, the way only one person in Marion knocked on Winona's door. Della Whitfield stood on the porch with a covered dish held in both hands and steam rising through the foil, and behind her, half hidden by her grandmother's skirt the way she always stood, was the girl, Pearl. 8 years old, with her father gone these 2 years to a job in another state that had swallowed him whole and never sent him back, and a way of watching grown people that reminded Winona painfully of herself at that age. The Whitfields lived 2 doors down on South Branson Street, in the matching half of a duplex that had gone up the same year as Winona's, brick for brick, when the malleable ironworks was still throwing sparks over the east side, and a working man could buy a house on a foundry wage. "You didn't come to the window yesterday," Della said. It was not an accusation. It was the closest thing Winona had to a person keeping count of her. "I made too much." "You'll take some or it goes to waste, and I won't have waste in my conscience." Winona stepped back to let them in. She had not eaten a proper meal since the birthday supper, since the toast and the letter laid beside the cake, and Garrett's wife already moving through the rooms with her phone held up, framing the windows for a listing, while Winona still held her fork. She had not had the appetite. But Della Whitfield set the dish on the kitchen table, right beside the open biscuit tin and the steno pads, and she did not ask one question about them, and that small grace undid something in Winona's chest. "Sit," Winona said. "Both of you. There's tea if Pearl will reach the good cups." Pearl reached the good cups, and while Della spooned out the supper she had carried down the street, Winona watched the girl set the saucers down square and careful, lining the handles all the same way, and she thought, without deciding to, that here was a child who noticed how things were supposed to go. Over the food Della talked, easy and low, and somewhere in it she said the thing that made Winona put down her cup. "My grandfather used to say your grandfather kept this whole street fed one winter and never once let on. Said Amos Carlisle carried a man's note 3 years through the worst of the Depression and tore it up when the man could finally pay and told him to never speak of it." Della shook her head. "I didn't know whether to believe it. Old men and their stories. But there's worse things to come from than a man like that." Winona said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the tin, at the pads, at the small slanting strokes that filled them, and she was thinking that she had spent her whole life believing her grandfather was a careful man, a measured man, a man who signed nothing he had not read 3 times, and he had been all of that. But underneath the careful man there had been another man entirely, one who carried other people's debts in silence and tore them up when the time came, and who had, somewhere in these pages, set aside a fortune for a stranger's child and pressed 3 words into the margin so hard the pencil nearly went through. "She is owed, too. Della," she said. "Did your people ever know a family named Tournier?" Della thought on it the way careful people think, turning it over before they answer. "Tournier," she said slowly. "There was a Tournier at the works, way back." "A partner," my grandfather said. "French name, came up from down south someplace. There was some trouble the year they sold the foundry." 48. She frowned. "He didn't make it through that year. I don't recall the why of it, just that the family scattered after and the name went out of the neighborhood." She looked at Winona. "Why do you ask after Tournier?" "Because my grandfather wrote it on a beam," Winona said, "and I mean to find out why." It took her 4 more nights of reading to find the rest of it, because Amos had not laid the story out plain. He had laid it the way a careful man lays a thing he does not want the wrong eyes to read fast, in pieces, across pages, so that only a person willing to do the slow work would ever assemble it. And Winona did the slow work. She sat at her own place at the kitchen table with the bare bulb of the cellar still cold in her memory, and she read pothook by pothook, and the story came up out of the strokes the way a photograph comes up in a tray. Lucien Tournier had been Amos's partner at the malleable iron works. Not on paper, not where the bank could see, but in the way that 2 men who do the same hard work for 30 years become partners whether the world records it or not. And in the winter of 1948, when the men who owned the foundry sold it out from under everyone, and the buyout money came down in a lump that was meant to scatter and vanish, Lucien Tournier had not lived to see his share. The pads did not say how. Amos had been gentle even with his own private record, had written only a few small strokes that Winona read 3 times and then sat back from, her hand over her mouth, because she understood them. There had been a hard accident at the works in its last bad year, when the owners were cutting corners on a place they no longer meant to keep, and Lucien Tournier had not come home from it, and he had left a daughter who, in the winter of 1948, was a small girl with no father and no foundry and no name left in the neighborhood to vouch for her, and Amos Carlisle, who could have taken his buyout and built the wall around his own blood and felt himself a generous man for it, had instead taken a part of that fortune, a good bond, a large one, and made it out to Lucien Tournier's child. Then he had hidden it in the cold room with the rest, written it in a code only his own granddaughter would ever learn, and trusted that someday she would carry his promise, the last mile he could not walk himself. She is owed too. Winona wrote the name down in shorthand on a fresh page, the way she wrote down everything that mattered, and beneath it she wrote what she meant to do, and then she put on the gray wool coat and went to find a girl who was now, if she still lived, a woman past 80. It took her 3 days and the patience of a court clerk. She walked to the county recorder's office on a gray morning with the celluloid card riding in her inside pocket, and she asked for the old plat books and the old deed indexes, and a young clerk sighed at her until an older woman came out from the back. Marguerite. Winona had stenographed across a courtroom from 100 women like Marguerite in 40 years, women who had kept the record straight while everyone above them took the credit, and the two of them knew each other inside of a minute, though they had never met. "Tournier," Marguerite said, running a finger down a column, "and you say 48. She pulled a ledger the size of a paving stone and turned it on the counter so they could both read, and there, in an entry as old as the sealed door, was the thing Winona had come to confirm, a trust. The Carlisle Family Trust, established in 1948, the duplex on South Branson Street held inside it, never owned by any single hand, never to be sold by any single hand, unbroken. Unbroken for 78 years, recorded and filed and waiting, exactly as her grandfather's pothooks had said it would be. "That's a strong instrument," Marguerite said quietly, and there was respect in it. "Somebody set this up to last. You don't see them built like this anymore." She looked up. "Whoever's been telling you that house is theirs to sell, ma'am, has been telling you a story this book doesn't agree with." Winona stood very straight at the counter. Out the tall window, the light came down gray over Marion, over the streets she had walked her whole life, over the place where the furnaces used to burn. "No," she said, "it does not agree with him at all." She found the daughter on the 4th day. Adele Tournier, 86 years old, in a nursing home on the north side of Marion, in a room with one window and a chair pulled close to it, and a lifetime of being no one's business folded into her small, straight back. Winona sat with her for an hour and did not at first say why she had come. She let the old woman talk, and when Adele spoke of her father, of the foundry, of the year everything scattered, her voice did not break, but her hands moved in her lap the way hands move when they are holding something that is not there. "My father had a friend," Adele said, "Carlisle. He came to the door after. My mother sent him away. We had our pride, you understand. We would not take charity." She looked out the window. "We had nothing for 40 years, but we had our pride. I have wondered since whether pride was worth what it cost us." Winona took the celluloid card from her pocket and held it a moment in her hand, the worn legend of the whole secret language, and then she put it away again, because this was not the hour for it. Instead, she said, "It was not charity, it was a debt. Your father earned it with 30 years of his life, and my grandfather kept it for you in a place no one could spend it but the person he trusted to find you. It took longer than he meant. I'm sorry for that. But you were owed, Miss Tournier. You have been owed for 78 years, and I have come to pay it." The old woman's hands went still in her lap. Winona walked home that evening with the gray coat buttoned to her throat and the streets of Marion going blue around her, and she felt for the first time in longer than she could name like a person with a purpose larger than keeping her own chair. She had set the Tournier provision in motion through a lawyer downtown that very afternoon, a quiet man who read the trust documents twice, and then a third time, and looked at Winona over his glasses with the particular expression of a professional encountering competence he had not expected. The bond was good. The trust held. Adele Tournier would not spend her last years in a room with one window wondering whether pride had been worth the cost. And it was on that walk home, with her own business nearly settled, that the last piece of it came to her. The piece she had been turning away from because it was the hardest. She had a son. She had a son who had stood up at her birthday supper and tapped his glass and laid an eviction letter beside her cake, performing his generosity for the room while he stripped her bare. And she knew now, because Della Whitfield had heard it from a man who heard it at the bank, why he had done it. Garrett had co-signed a balloon mortgage on a house he had meant to flip and could not sell, and the clock on it was running down, and the equity in the duplex on South Branson Street was the only thing standing between her son and the ruin he had built with his own hands. He had not evicted his mother because he was cruel, exactly. He had evicted her because he was drowning, and a drowning man will climb onto whatever is nearest, even if it is his mother, even if it is the chair she has sat in for 40 years. She could have gone to him with the trust documents and the recorder's ledger and Marguerite's finger on the unbroken entry, and she could have broken him with it the way he had tried to break her. The proof was in her hands. The house was never his. His mortgage was void, written against a thing he did not own and never had, and the moment that came to light his whole house of cards would come down and the debt would stay his, and his alone. But Winona Carlisle had spent 40 years in courtrooms, watching people win in ways that left nothing standing, and she had learned that the record is best made slow and missing nothing, and at the right hour. So she did not go to him in anger. She went home, and she sat down at her own place at her own table, and she took out a clean sheet of paper, and in her small, slanting hand she wrote out an invitation to her son and to his banker to come for tea. They came on a Thursday because Garrett had said Thursday was the only afternoon his banker could spare, and Winona had agreed to it the way you agree to a thing you have already won, with no fuss in your voice at all. She set the kitchen table the way her mother had taught her before the relatives came and called her mother, no use to anyone now, and put her out into a borrowed room to finish her days. She used the good cups, the ones Pearl had lined up so carefully a week before. She put out the small pot and the milk in the little pitcher and a plate of the plain shortbread she had made that morning. And in the center of the table, square in the middle where a centerpiece would go, she set the japanned biscuit tin with the worn lid and the faded flowers, closed, waiting. Garrett came in his good coat. He had always worn his good coat to do his worst things, as if the wool could vouch for him. Behind him came a younger man in a better coat still, carrying a leather folio under his arm, and Winona knew before a word was spoken that this was the banker, the one whose name was on the other end of her son's drowning. "Mr. Pruitt," Garrett said by way of introduction, and the man put out a soft hand, and Winona took it and found it exactly as soft as she had expected. "Sit," she said, "both of you. The tea is fresh." They sat. Garrett's wife did not come. Winona noticed that and set it aside. She poured for the banker first because he was the guest, and then for her son, and then for herself. And she did it slowly, with the steady hand of a woman who had transcribed 40 years of other people's panic without ever letting it into her own fingers. Garrett watched her pour and could not keep the impatience out of his foot, which tapped under the table the way it had tapped when he was 9 and wanted to be excused. "Mother," he said, when he could bear the quiet no longer, "I'm glad you've come around to being reasonable about all this. Mr. Pruitt's only here to help us move things along. The sooner the paperwork's clean, the sooner we can get you settled somewhere that's, easier for you." "Easier," Winona repeated. She set down the pot. "Yes, let's make it easier." And she reached out and lifted the lid of the tin. She took out the top steno pad, the one she had marked with a strip of paper, and she opened it flat on the table beside the shortbread, and she put on her glasses, and she began to read aloud. Not fast. She read the way she had read back a record to a judge 1,000 times, each word set down whole and given its full weight, no hurry and no heat. Entry, Winter of 1948, she read. The duplex at South Branson Street, both halves, brick and lot, is placed entire into the Carlisle family trust, to be held and never personally owned, never sold by any single hand, the income to keep the family roof against any hard year to come. She turned the pad a quarter so the strokes faced her son, though he could no more read them than read the bottom of the sea. That is my grandfather's hand. That is the trust the county recorder has on file under its own number, unbroken for 78 years. I have seen the book. A woman named Marguerite turned the page for me herself. The banker had stopped with his cup halfway up. He set it down without drinking. The house has never belonged to a person, Winona said. Not to my grandfather, not to my father, not to me, and not Garrett to you. It belongs to the trust. A thing held in trust cannot be pledged by one of the people it shelters. It cannot be put up against a loan. She looked at the banker, mild as milk. Mr. Pruitt, I expect you know what that means for a mortgage co-signed against this address. Mr. Pruitt's soft face had gone a careful blank, the blank of a man doing sums he did not like the answer to. Mrs. Carlisle, I'd need our people to review the— You would, Winona agreed, and they will. That is rather the point. Garrett's foot had stopped tapping. Mother. Whatever you think you've found in that old tin, it's scribble. It's shorthand. Nobody can read it. It won't stand up to anything. You've spent a week with a dead woman's notebook and you think, I think, Winona said, that you have called it scribble your whole life, and I let you, because it cost me nothing to be underestimated by my own boy. But a court will want to know whose hand wrote it, and whether it can be trusted, and whether the woman reading it back is reading it true or making it up to suit herself. She reached into the pocket of the gray wool coat that hung on the back of her chair, and she brought out the celluloid card, the little worn alphabet card her grandfather had slipped into her coat when she was 6 years old and told her to keep, that she had carried for 69 years as nothing more than a keepsake of a man who loved her. She laid it down on the open pad beside the strokes, and she turned them both so the banker could see. This is the legend, she said. Every mark in these pages answers to a mark on this card. The card is in my grandfather's hand, the same hand that wrote the pads, the same hand the Recorder's Trust was filed under in '48. They match, letter for letter, the way a key matches the lock it was cut for. A man you bring in to check my reading will hold this card beside these pages, and he will tell you I have read every word of it true. She paused. The proof was sitting in plain sight the whole time, in a biscuit tin, in a child's coat pocket. You only had to be able to read it. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere down South Branson Street, a screen door banged and a dog answered it, and then that was quiet too. Garrett's face had begun to come apart, slowly the way ice comes apart, in a crack you hear before you see. If the house was never mine, he said, and his voice had gone small, then the loan stays yours, Winona said gently. All of it. You pledged a thing you did not own and never could. When Mr. Pruitt's people look into how that pledge was made, and they will look now, because they must, the bank will step back from it the way a man steps back from a hole he nearly walked into. They will not want their name near it. And the flip that would not sell, and the balloon that is coming due, and every dollar of it will be exactly where you put it. On you. She picked up her own cup at last, and she drank from it, and she set it down without a sound. You can't lose what was never yours to borrow against, she said. She let him sit in it. She had learned that, too, in the courtrooms, that the worst sentence is the silence after the verdict, when a man finally hears the size of the thing he did. Mr. Pruitt was already gathering his folio, already half standing, already a man who had remembered an appointment, and Winona did not stop him. He would carry it back to the bank, and the bank would do the careful, cowardly, correct thing, and the review would open, And somewhere in a glass office, a younger version of this same soft man would draw a line through her son's lifeline and not lose a wink of sleep over it. That was not her doing. That was the natural weight of a thing pledged falsely, finding its level at last. When the banker had gone, Garrett stayed in his chair, his good coat suddenly too big for him. "What happens to me?" he said. "Not cruel now, just a man at the bottom of the well looking up." "That is yours to answer," Winona said. "Not mine. You could fix it. You've got the trust, the bonds, all of it. You could make it go away with one signature." "I could." She folded her hands on the table. "I won't. The house stays in the trust where my grandfather put it, sheltering whoever lives under this roof, and that is no longer going to be a thing you can spend." She looked at him, and there was no triumph in her face, and no tears either, only the long, flat steadiness of a woman who had decided. "I will offer you one thing, Garrett. Not the house. Not my chair. There is work to be done with these pads, copying them out, making them plain for the lawyer and the recorder. It is slow work and exact work, and it pays a fair fee. If you want it, you will learn the shorthand to do it. You will sit where I sat at 6 and learn the marks. Earn it in shorthand if you want it." He stared at her as if she had spoken in the pothooks themselves. Then he stood, and he buttoned the good coat over nothing, and he went out the door he had once promised to put her out of, and he did not slam it. She heard his car start. She heard it pull away down the street her grandfather had once kept fed through a whole winter and never let on. She did not go to the window to watch him go. The lawyer downtown finished the Tournier provision the following week. Winona was not there to see the rest of it, but Marguerite told her, the next time she came to the recorder's office, that the home on the north side had moved Adele Tournier out of the room with the one window and into a corner room with two, where the morning came in, and that someone had quietly settled what was owed against her care so that no one could put her anywhere ever again. And Marguerite told her something else, lower, leaning across the counter. The trust filing had been so plainly built, so unbreakable, that the recorder's office had begun pointing to it. When other old families came in, frightened that a child or a creditor meant to sell the roof out from under them, they were writing the Carlisle instrument into a little guide for the clerks. A name on a beam in a cold cellar had become a line other families could stand on. Winona only nodded at that and pulled her coat closed, and walked home through Marion with the gray light coming down soft over the east side, over the dead furnaces, over the duplex that no single hand would ever sell. She did not eat alone that night. Della Whitfield came with a dish, as she did most nights now, and Pearl came behind her, and after the supper was cleared, Winona did not put the tin away. She set it on the kitchen table between herself and the girl, and she opened it, and she took out a clean pad and 2 pencils, and she laid one pencil in front of Pearl. "Your father isn't coming back to teach you things," Winona said. "I'm sorry for that. It's a true thing, and I won't pretend it isn't. But I have a thing to teach, and you have the eyes for it. I watched you set my saucers square. You notice how things are supposed to go. That's the whole of it, really. That's where it starts." Pearl picked up the pencil the way you pick up something you have decided to be careful with. Winona drew the first mark, slow, on the open page, a small curved stroke like the start of a breath. "That one's the easiest," she said. "Make it next to mine." The girl bent over the page, her tongue between her teeth, and drew it. It was crooked. It was hers. Della watched from the doorway with the dish towel in her hands and said nothing because there was nothing to say to it. Down the street, the lamps were coming on. On the table, the bare little pencil moved beside the older hand, stroke and stroke, and Winona reached up without thinking and wrote the next mark in the air first, the way she always had, before she set it on the page for the child to follow. She had already chosen the tin she would give her, a plain one with a tight lid that would keep its word. Winona laid her hand over the girl's and steadied the third stroke. The lamp held them both in its small, warm circle. 75, and finally unsealed.